This is the story of a valley with a name like running water, the Shenandoah, and a man with a name like Granite, the man they called Stonewall, and of how they came together to make a legend in the long ago year of 1862. He wasn't always Stonewall. At first, he was plain Thomas Jonathan Jackson, born 1824 in the backwoods town of Clarksburg, Virginia, now West Virginia. He got to West Point by sheer determination. The Mexican War. Men who fought at Chapultepec never forgot 23-year-old Lieutenant Jackson, standing alone in a storm of fire, as cool as a Sunday walk. Peacetime, he became a teacher, a professor of physics and artillery at Virginia Military Institute. 10 years passed. The VMI cadets took to calling him Tomfool Jackson, an eccentric man, aloof, unsmiling, deeply religious, and not very impressive to look at. He might have remained Tomfool Jackson for the rest of his life if the guns had not spoken at Fort Sumter one April day in 1861. He offered his services to his beloved Virginia, and it was Jackson's brigade that stood firm on a ridge at Manassas and, in that first great battle of the war, turned the tide for the Confederacy. There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally round the Virginians. From that day and ever after, he was Stonewall Jackson. November 1861. They put him in charge of the forces in the Shenandoah Valley. 4,600 men. Brave, tough, high in morale, facing a Union army of 35,000. Hold the valley, they said, and hold the valley he did, because it was vital. This narrow corridor of bountiful farmland, running 165 miles between the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Alleghenies. It was a natural invasion route into the north, aimed at the capital, Washington. It held the richest farms in all the Confederacy. Lose the valley, and you lost the breadbasket of Virginia. Lose the valley, and it was a good chance you'd lost the war. The silent professor with the new name of Stonewall drilled his rough troops, and drilled some more. By March of 1862, Jackson was ready. Now, the North had a plan. They would skewer Virginia on the three prongs of a fork, take Richmond, and end the war. General McClellan would come by sea, then ascend the peninsula between the James and York rivers. General McDowell would hold his army above Fredericksburg to protect Washington until General Banks drove Jackson from the Shenandoah Valley. Then, with the valley secure, Banks could draw his troops back to guard Washington, and McDowell would be free to march on Richmond through the heart of Virginia. It didn't work. Simply because Stonewall Jackson, in the next 3 months, waged one of the most brilliant campaigns in military history. Jackson's Valley Campaign, the history books call it. In later years, Stonewall's veterans would proudly remember a time of forced marches at night. A of movements so swift the North couldn't believe it, of bad roads boldly chosen to mystify the enemy, of dawn attacks on improbable terrain, of odds that were often 4-1 against them. And always, they'd remember Stonewall, that immense controlled energy burning in his eyes, that calm logic untroubled in the hurricane of battle. Stonewall, rigidly demanding in battle, yet ever watchful for the well-being of his troops. Patient, courteous to the youngest private. Stonewall, praying at evening with his men. General Banks crossed the Potomac and advanced on Winchester. Reluctantly, Stonewall withdrew before the superior Union forces. Up the valley to Mount Jackson. Slowly, always slowly, Banks followed. And then, deciding that Jackson had fled the valley, he began to pull the bulk of his army back to Manassas for the protection of Washington. Jackson, informed that only a rear guard remained at Winchester, struck. Incredibly swift, he came down the valley, and after a 36-hour continuous march, hurled an attack at the enemy's flank. Kernstown, 3,000 men against what in reality was an army of 9,000. 2 hours they fought before Jackson was forced to retire. They call it Stonewall's only defeat. But out of that defeat came a strategic victory. General Banks, now believing Stonewall had reinforcements, turned around and marched back to the valley. And President Lincoln was forced to make some fateful decisions. Fearing for Washington, he held McDowell's army north. He sent a division to reinforce Fremont's army in West Virginia. And General McClellan's plan to take Richmond was mortally weakened. Nearly a month passed while cautious General Banks inched up the valley. 20,000 men under General Fremont headed from West Virginia to strike Jackson's rear. But now Stonewall had been reinforced with 8,500 men under General Baldy Dick Ewell. Boldly, he split his forces. Leaving Ewell with a small part of his army to threaten Banks, he began a remarkable and mystifying maneuver. It looked like he was headed for the defense of Richmond. But then suddenly he turned west, choosing where he'd give battle because that was Stonewall's way. He met Fremont's army near the mountain town of McDowell. A 5-hour battle, and the 20,000 Federals were running back to West Virginia. Meanwhile, a confident Banks sat at Strasburg, thinking Ewell's division was the only Confederate force in the valley. In a series of lightning marches, Stonewall passed through the New Market Gap and the Massanutten Mountain, joined Ewell, and with a mountain to hide his movement, streaked for the rear of Banks' army. He seized Front Royal from a small Union force and raced for Winchester to cut Banks off. The Battle of Winchester. Banks was crushed, routed. He fled across the Potomac. The Shenandoah Valley belonged to Stonewall. Now his army stood on the threshold of Washington, and there was panic in the northern capital. President Lincoln decided on desperate measures to crush that rebel upstart once and for all. Three armies were launched against Jackson. Banks from the north, Fremont from the west, and McDowell from the east. 63,000 federal troops against Jackson's 16,000. Just in time, Stonewall learned of the Nutcracker strategy. Marching at night through driving rain, on short rations, his army slipped through the closing jaws. Again, that Stonewall audacity. He divided his troops to meet the vastly superior Union forces. June 8th at Cross Keys, Ewell's division turned back Fremont's Western Army. June 9th at Port Republic, Jackson shattered the advance column of McDowell's army. The demoralized federal armies retreated from the valley, and not until 1864 would they try again. Stonewall's Valley campaign was over. He slipped from the valley to join Lee, and together, in the 7 days' battles, they repulsed McClellan's advance and saved Richmond. There would be other victories. Second Manassas, Harper's Ferry, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. And it was there, on the evening of the second day of battle, that he was shot by mistake, by his own pickets. General Lee sent word, "You have lost your left arm, but I have lost my right arm." On May 10th, 1863, Stonewall Jackson lay dying, and he knew it. As calm before the great enemy death as before all the others, he said, quietly and clearly, "Let us cross the river and rest in the shade of the trees." And then he crossed over. He was 39 years old. Now the tide ran against the Confederacy. Grant, the new Union leader, would strike at Richmond with 3 armies. By sea, and then up the peninsula, south through the heart of Virginia, south through the valley. Again the Shenandoah ran with blood. Sigel's Union Army was turned back at New Market with the help of the entire VMI Corps of Cadets. Then General Hunter, spreading destruction up the Shenandoah, burning VMI to the ground, finally driven from the valley by General Jubal Early. With Early camped on the doorstep of Washington, Grant lost patience. He sent General Sheridan at the head of 50,000 seasoned troops, finally to take the valley out of the war. "Eat out the valley," Grant ordered, "so that crows flying over it will have to carry their provender with them." Sheridan, the Avenger, the unyielding Sheridan. He defeated Jubal Early at Winchester and Fisher's Hill, crushed him at Cedar Creek. He burned the crops. He slaughtered the stock. He felled the orchards. And when he was finished, this most fruitful valley was a smoldering, bleak, and starved land. Perhaps it had to be, to bring at last the peace of Appomattox. But there were men who would always wonder, if Jackson had been here, if Stonewall had lived, could he have saved the valley? It blooms again today, this valley where the Shenandoah runs. Its fields have forgotten the agony of those great and terrible battles. But a spirit broods over this place. He's here, everywhere. He rests in the shade of the trees. The serious, shy professor who rewrote the Book of War. This will always be Stonewall's Valley.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.